You were named the chief draftsperson of Title IX, so talk about how that came to be and what your role was in the creation of it.
I was in the Civil Rights Division of what was then the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in 1972 when Title IX was passed, and the Secretary appointed a small group of people from the Office for Civil Rights and from the General Counsel's Office, which is where I worked. And our job was to translate the statute, which is a fairly broad statute, as civil rights statutes often are, into a detailed regulation that would let schools and colleges that got federal money know what their obligations were. And we worked probably for a year with a number of outside groups and the Office of Education and people from the interested congressional staffs. It's a very bipartisan approach, interestingly, from Congress at the time, and proposed a draft regulation in 1974, I think. Went out for public comment and got a lot of public comment, not unexpectedly, and the regulation was actually promulgated, I think, in 1975. I believe it was actually one of the first regulations that President Ford signed. And although there have been some changes in the athletics pieces, the central part of the regulation, which we wrote back then, has been in effect ever since. And my job as a fairly young attorney was to basically be the kind of secretary of this committee. I wrote most of the drafts and circulated the drafts and collected the comments internally, and a part of my responsibility was to help make sure that we had some kind of meeting schedule and people actually stayed on task, which was an interesting proposition for someone who was relatively junior. Very, very rewarding piece of work to have done, not knowing as a young attorney just what I'd be doing when I came into HEW, and to suddenly have this chance was really a very neat thing.
Now, what were the biggest pitfalls, or what kind of problems did you come up against in the creation of Title IX?
Well, I would say there were probably two or three. One was that Title IX does have some areas where it permits single-sex activity. It exempted admissions policies of private undergraduate institutions, because many institutions at that time either were all male or all female, and it was believed that although they should be subject to Title IX because they were getting federal money, that we wanted to let private higher education have some diversity. There were some issues in the elementary and secondary part of it, because things like, boys taking industrial arts and girls taking home ec were pretty well ingrained, although I dealt only with the higher ed part. We wanted to make sure that we did not come up with conflicting rules for faculty from what existed under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which covered employment. And we wanted to cover athletics in a way that was sensible. And of course, the issue in athletics is it's one of the few areas in civil rights law where, instead of trying to get everybody to come into the same room under the same requirements with the same opportunity, we're instead definitionally saying we're going to have separate activities, but we want them to be truly equal. Almost all of civil rights law pushes in the other direction. We were trying to find a way to define separate but really equal opportunity, and to measure that in a way that would make sense at a time when there really wasn't very much women's athletics in higher education. And so we knew that we would be creating something really from the beginning, and we wanted to do it in a careful way. We wanted to make sure there was adequate time for it to work, but we didn't want the timetables to be dragged out, because the rights that Title IX provides are individual rights for individual people, not to be discriminated against. And we knew that whatever transition period we provided would mean that there would be some young women who would not have opportunities that would follow after that. And so we wanted to be careful, and we wanted something that would work, but we wanted to be as prompt as we could.
Did you know how important Title IX was when you were creating it?
Well, it was easy to know, really, how important Title IX was as an educational matter. Not only did the extensive hearings make that sense, but this was a time of great social ferment. The early 1970s, the Equal Rights Amendment was before Congress. The employment parts of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had taken effect. And there was just a great deal of social change of every kind. And the women's movement was beginning to take shape. Some of the prominent publications in the women's movement had come out. And anybody who looked around knew that there were substantial exclusionary practices throughout higher education that limited women's opportunities. Med schools admitted men and nursing schools admitted women. You could be a pilot if you were a man, you could be a stewardess if you were a woman. We now know that there were women graduating from law school who became Supreme Court justices who were offered jobs as secretaries at law firms, and they were among the small group of women who'd gotten into law school in the first place. So there were clearly widespread barriers to women having educational opportunity in higher education, and we couldn't predict what the consequences would be, but we knew that when those barriers broke down, women's opportunities would be enormously expanded, and we thought, and we were right, that the country would benefit greatly from being able to tap into the competence and skill and creativity of the half of the population that was being really in most ways excluded from higher education.
And how was Title IX received by not only the nation, by the universities and schools, but also by the Ivy League?
Well, I think I, of course, didn't come to work in the Ivy League until much later, although I was an Ivy alum. And interestingly, the Ivy institutions that did not admit women as undergraduates had already begun to admit women as undergraduates at the time Title IX was passed. So it was not a new or revolutionary action, I think, for our institutions. And I don't know that Ivy institutions were necessarily any better, but certainly not any worse in opening up medical schools and law schools and engineering schools and admissions generally to women and to becoming truly equal. Dormitories got changed. It's actually not all that hard when you think about it to change the physical layout. I think the hardest part was and continues to be in institutions across the country in providing truly equal opportunity in faculty employment because of the tenure system. So no matter how willing you were in 1973 or 74 or 75 to truly hire on an equal basis, if your faculty was only turning over at 5 or 10% a year, you had limited opportunities to do that. And because of the discrimination in graduate education, even a school that wanted to make extra efforts to hire women found that the faculty pools in the early 70s continued to be very, very heavily male-dominated. And so it took a longer time to begin to open up and change faculties than it did to change undergraduate education, because you could simply change the rules for the next class and make substantial changes in who your undergraduates were.